Giulia Lazzari, an Ashenden spy story by Somerset Maugham. Ashenden was in the habit of asserting that he was never bored. It was one of his notions that only such persons were as had no resources in themselves, and it was but the stupid that depended on the outside world for their amusement. Ashenden had no illusions about himself, and such success in current letters as had come to him had left his head unturned. He distinguished acutely between fame and the notoriety that rewards the author of a successful novel or a popular play, and he was indifferent to this except in so far as it was attended with tangible benefits. He was perfectly ready to take advantage of his familiar name to get a better stateroom in a ship than he had paid for, and if a customs house officer passed his luggage unopened because he had read his short stories, Ashenden was pleased to admit that the pursuit of literature had its compensations. He sighed when eager young students of the drama sought to discuss its technique with him, and when gushing ladies tremulously whispered in his ear their admiration of his books, he often wished he was dead. But he thought himself intelligent, and so it was absurd that he should be bored. It was a fact that he could talk with interest to persons commonly thought so excruciatingly dull that their fellows fled from them as though they owed them money. It may be that here he was but indulging the professional instinct that was seldom dormant in him. They, his raw material, did not bore him any more than fossils bore the geologist. And now he had everything that a reasonable man could want for his entertainment. He had pleasant rooms in a good hotel, and Geneva is one of the most agreeable cities in Europe to live in. He hired a boat and rode on the lake, or hired a horse and trotted sedately. For in that neat and orderly canton it is difficult to find a stretch of turf where you can have a good gallop along the macadamized roads in the environs of the town. He wandered on foot about its old streets, trying among those grey stone houses, so quiet and dignified, to recapture the spirit of a past age. He read again with delight Rousseau's Confessions, and for the second or third time tried in vain to get on with La Nouvelle Héloïse. He wrote. He knew few people, for it was his business to keep in the background, but he had picked up a chatting acquaintance with several persons living in his hotel, and he was not lonely. His life was sufficiently filled, it was varied, and when he had nothing else to do, he could enjoy his own reflections. It was absurd to think that, under these circumstances, he could possibly be bored, and yet, like a little lonely cloud in the sky, he did see in the offing the possibility of boredom. There is a story that Louis XIV, having summoned a courtier to attend him on a ceremonial occasion, found himself ready to go as the courtier appeared. He turned to him and with icy majesty said, "J'ai failli attendre," of which the only translation I can give, but a poor one, is, "I have but just escaped waiting." So Ashenden might have admitted that he now but just escaped being bored. It might be, he mused, as he rode along the lake on a dappled horse with a great rump and a short neck, like one of those prancing steeds that you see in old pictures, but this horse never pranced, and he needed a firm jab with the spur to break even into a smart trot. It might be, he mused, that the great chiefs of the Secret Service in their London offices, their hands on the throttle of this great machine, led a life full of excitement. They moved their pieces here and there. They saw the pattern woven by the multitudinous threads. Ashenden was lavish with his metaphors. They made a picture out of the various pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. But it must be confessed that for the small fry like himself to be a member of the Secret Service was not as adventurous an affair as the public thought. Ashenden's official existence was as orderly and monotonous as a city clerk's. He saw his spies at stated intervals and paid them their wages. When he could get hold of a new one, he engaged him, gave him his instructions, and sent him off to Germany. He waited for the information that came through and dispatched it. He went into France once a week to confer with his colleague over the frontier, and to receive his orders from London. He visited the marketplace on market day to get any message the old butter woman had brought him from the other side of the lake. He kept his eyes and ears open, and he wrote long reports which he was convinced no one read, till having inadvertently slipped a jest into one of them, he received a sharp reproof for his levity. The work he was doing was evidently necessary, but it could not be called anything but monotonous. At one moment, for something better to do, he had considered the possibility of a flirtation with the Baroness von Higgins. He was confident now that she was an agent in the service of the Austrian government, and he looked forward to a certain entertainment in the duel he foresaw. It would be amusing to set his wits against hers. He was quite aware that she would lay snares for him, and to avoid them would give him something to keep his mind from rusting. He found her not unwilling to play the game. She wrote him gushing little notes when he sent her flowers. She went for a row with him on the lake, and letting her long white hand drag through the water, talked of love and hinted at a broken heart. They dined together and went to see a performance in French and in prose of Romeo and Juliet. Ashenden had not made up his mind how far he was prepared to go when he received a sharp note from R to ask him what he was playing at. Information had come to hand that he, Ashenden, was much in the society of a woman calling herself the Baroness de Higgins, who was known to be an agent of the Central Powers, and it was most undesirable that he should be on any terms with her but those of frigid courtesy. Ashenden shrugged his shoulders. R did not think him as clever as he thought himself, but he was interested to discover, what he had not known before, that there was someone in Geneva, part of whose duties at all events was to keep an eye on him. There was evidently someone who had orders to see that did not neglect his work or get into mischief. Ashenden was not a little amused. What a shrewd, unscrupulous old thing was R. He took no risks. He trusted nobody. He made use of his instruments, but, high or low, had no opinion of them. Ashenden looked about to see whether he could spot the person who had told R what he was doing. He wondered if it was one of the waiters in the hotel. He knew that R had a great belief in waiters. They had the chance of seeing so much and could so easily get into places where information was lying about to be picked up. He even wondered whether R had got his news from the Baroness herself. It would not be so strange if, after all, she was employed by the secret service of one of the Allied nations. Ashenden continued to be polite to the Baroness, but ceased to be attentive. He turned his horse and trotted gently back to Geneva. An ostler from the riding stables was waiting at the hotel door, and slipping out of the saddle, Ashenden went into the hotel. At the desk, the porter handed him a telegram. It was to the following effect: Aunt Maggie not at all well. Staying at Hotel Lottie, Paris. If possible, please go and see her. Raymond. Raymond was one of R's facetious noms de guerre, and since Ashenden was not so fortunate as to possess an Aunt Maggie, he concluded that this was an order to go to Paris. It had always seemed to Ashenden that R had spent much of his spare time in reading detective fiction, and especially when he was in a good humour, he found a fantastic pleasure in aping the style of the shilling shocker. If R was in a good humour, it meant that he was about to bring off a coup, for when he had brought one off, he was filled with depression and then vented his spleen on his subordinates. Ashenden, leaving his telegram with deliberate carelessness on the desk, asked at what time the express left for Paris. He glanced at the clock to see whether he had time to get to the consulate before it closed and secure his visa. When he went upstairs to fetch his passport, the porter, just as the lift doors were closed, called him. "Monsieur has forgotten his telegram," he said. "How stupid of me," said Ashenden. Now Ashenden knew that if an Austrian baroness by any chance wondered why he had so suddenly gone to Paris, she would discover that it was owing to the indisposition of a female relative. In those troublous times of war, it was just as well that everything should be clear and above board. He was known at the French consulate, and so lost little time there. He had told the porter to get him a ticket, and on his return to the hotel bathed and changed. He was not a little excited at the prospect of this unexpected jaunt. He liked the journey. He slept well in a sleeping car and was not disturbed if a sudden jolt waked him. It was pleasant to lie a while smoking a cigarette and to feel oneself in one's little cabin, so enchantingly alone. The rhythmical sound as the wheels rattled over the points was an agreeable background to the pattern of one's reflections, and to speed through the open country and the night made one feel like a star speeding through space, and at the end of the journey was the unknown. When Ashenden arrived in Paris, it was chilly, and a light rain was falling. He felt unshaved, and he wanted a bath and clean linen. But he was in excellent spirits. He telephoned from the station to R and asked how Aunt Maggie was. "I'm glad to see that your affection for her was great enough to allow you to waste no time in getting here," answered R, with the ghost of a chuckle in his voice. "She's very low, but I'm sure it'll do her good to see you." Ashenden reflected that this was the mistake the amateur humorist, as opposed to the professional, so often made. When he made a joke, he harped on it. The relations of the joker to his joke should be as quick and desultory as those of a bee to its flower. He should make his joke and pass on. There is, of course, no harm if, like the bee approaching the flower, he buzzes a little, for it is just as well to announce to a thick-headed world that a joke is intended. But Ashenden, unlike most professional humorists, had a kindly tolerance for other people's humor, and now he answered R on his own lines. "When would she like to see me, do you think?" he asked. "Give her my love, won't you?" Now R quite distinctly chuckled. Ashenden sighed. "She'll want to titivate a little before you come, I expect. You know what she is. She likes to make the best of herself. Shall we say 10:30? And then, when you've had a talk to her, we might go out and lunch together somewhere." "All right," said Ashenden. "I'll come to the Lottie at 10:30. When Ashenden, clean and refreshed, reached the hotel, an orderly whom he recognized met him in the hall and took him up to R's apartment. He opened the door and showed Ashenden in. R was standing with his back to a bright log fire dictating to his secretary. "Sit down," said R, and went on with his dictation. It was a nicely furnished sitting room, and a bunch of roses in a bowl gave the impression of a woman's hand. On a large table was a litter of papers. R looked older than when last Ashenden had seen him. His thin yellow face was more lined, and his hair was greyer. The work was telling on him. He did not spare himself. He was up at 7 every morning, and he worked late into the night. His uniform was spick and span, but he wore it shabbily. "That'll do," he said. "Take all this stuff away and get on with the typing. I'll sign before I go out to lunch." Then he turned to the orderly. "I don't want to be disturbed." The secretary, a second lieutenant in the 30s, obviously a civilian with a temporary commission, gathered up a mass of papers and left the room. As the orderly was following, R said, "Wait outside. If I want you, I'll call." "Very good, sir." When they were alone, R turned to Ashenden with what for him was cordiality. "Have a nice journey up?" "Yes, sir." "What do you think of this?" he asked, looking round the room. "Not bad, is it? I never see why one shouldn't do what one can to mitigate the hardships of war." While he was idly chatting, R gazed at Ashenden with a singular fixity. The stare of those pale eyes of his, too closely set together, gave you the impression that he looked at your naked brain and had a very poor opinion of what he saw there. R, in rare moments of expansion, made no secret of the fact that he looked upon his fellow men as fools or knaves. That was one of the obstacles he had to contend with in his calling. On the whole, he preferred them knaves. You knew then what you were up against and could take steps accordingly. He was a professional soldier and had spent his career in India and the colonies. At the outbreak of the war, he was stationed in Jamaica, and someone in the War Office who had had dealings with him, remembering him, brought him over and put him in the intelligence department. His astuteness was so great that he very soon occupied an important post. He had an immense energy and a gift for organization, no scruples, but resource, courage, and determination. He had perhaps but one weakness. Throughout his life, he had never come in contact with persons, especially women, of any social consequence. The only women he had ever known were the wives of his brother officers, the wives of government officials, and of businessmen. And when coming to London at the beginning of the war, his work brought him into contact with brilliant, beautiful, and distinguished women, he was unduly dazzled. They made him feel shy, but he cultivated their society. He became quite a ladies' man, and to Ashenden, who knew more about him than R suspected, that bowl of roses told a story. Ashenden knew that R had not sent for him to talk about the weather and the crops, and wondered when he was coming to the point. He did not wonder long. "You've been doing pretty well in Geneva," he said. "I'm glad you think that, sir," replied Ashenden. Suddenly, R looked very cold and stern. He had done with idle talk. "I've got a job for you," he said. Ashenden made no reply, but he felt a happy little flutter somewhere about the pit of his stomach. "Have you ever heard of Chandra Lal?" "No, sir." A frown of impatience for an instant darkened the colonel's brow. He expected his subordinates to know everything he wished them to know. "Where have you been living all these years?" "At 36 Chesterfield Street, Mayfair," returned Ashenden. The shadow of a smile crossed R's yellow face. The somewhat impertinent reply was after his own sardonic heart. He went over to the big table and opened a dispatch case that lay upon it. He took out a photograph and handed it to Ashenden. "That's him." To Ashenden, unused to Oriental faces, it looked like any of 100 Indians that he had seen. It might have been the photograph of one or other of the Rajas who come periodically to England and are portrayed in the illustrated papers. It showed a fat-faced, swarthy man with full lips and a fleshy nose. His hair was black, thick and straight, and his very large eyes, even in the photograph, were liquid and cow-like. He looked ill at ease in European clothes. "Here he is in native dress," said R, giving Ashenden another photograph. This was full length, whereas the first had shown only the head and shoulders, and it had evidently been taken some years earlier. He was thinner, and his great serious eyes seemed to devour his face. It was done by a native photographer in Calcutta, and the surroundings were naively grotesque. Chandra Lal stood against a background on which had been painted a pensive palm tree and a view of the sea. One hand rested on a heavily carved table on which was a rubber plant in a flower pot. But in his turban and long, pale tunic, he was not without dignity. "What do you think of him?" asked R. "I should have said he was a man not without personality. There is a certain force there. Here's his dossier. Read it, will you?" R gave Ashenden a couple of typewritten pages, and Ashenden sat down. R put on his spectacles and began to read the letters that awaited his signature. Ashenden skimmed the report and then read it a second time more attentively. It appeared that Chandra Lal was a dangerous agitator. He was a lawyer by profession, but had taken up politics and was bitterly hostile to the British rule in India. He was a partisan of armed force and had been on more than one occasion responsible for riots in which life had been lost. He was once arrested, tried, and sentenced to 2 years in imprisonment. But he was at liberty at the beginning of the war, and seizing his opportunity began to foment active rebellion. He was at the heart of plots to embarrass the British in India and so prevent them from transferring troops to the seat of war, and with the help of immense sums given to him by German agents, he was able to cause a great deal of trouble. He was concerned in 2 or 3 bomb outrages, which, though beyond killing a few innocent bystanders, they did little harm, yet shook the nerves of the public and so damaged its morale. He evaded all attempts to arrest him, his activity was formidable, he was here and there, but the police could never lay hands on him, and they only learned that he had been in some city when, having done his work, he had left it. At last a high reward was offered for his arrest on a charge of murder, but he escaped the country, got to America, from there went to Sweden, and eventually reached Berlin. Here he busied himself with schemes to create disaffection among the native troops that had been brought to Europe. All this was narrated dryly, without comment or explanation. But from the very frigidity of the narrative, you got a sense of mystery and adventure, of hairbreadth escapes and dangers dangerously encountered. The report ended as follows. C has a wife in India and 2 children. He is not known to have anything to do with women. He neither drinks nor smokes. He is said to be honest. Considerable sums of money have passed through his hands, and there has never been any question as to his not having made a proper use of them. He has undoubted courage and is a hard worker. He is said to pride himself on keeping his word. Ashenden returned the document to R. Well, a fanatic? Ashenden thought there was about the man something rather romantic and attractive, but he knew that R did not want any nonsense of that sort from him. He looks like a very dangerous fellow. He is the most dangerous conspirator in or out of India. He's done more harm than all the rest of them put together. You know that there's a gang of these Indians in Berlin. Well, he's the brains of it. If he could be got out of the way, I could afford to ignore the others. He's the only one who has any guts. I've been trying to catch him for a year. I thought there wasn't a hope. But now at last, I've got a chance. And by God, I'm going to take it. And what'll you do then? R chuckled grimly. Shoot him, and shoot him damn quick. Ashenden did not answer. R walked once or twice across the small room, and then, again with his back to the fire, faced Ashenden. His thin mouth was twisted by a sarcastic smile. Did you notice at the end of that report I gave you? It said he wasn't known to have anything to do with women? Well, that was true, but it isn't any longer. The damned fool has fallen in love. R stepped over to his dispatch case and took out a bundle tied up with pale blue ribbon. Look, here are his love letters. You're a novelist. It might amuse you to read them. In fact, you should read them. It will help you to deal with the situation. Take them away with you. R flung the neat little bundle back into the dispatch case. One wonders how an able man like that can allow himself to get besotted over a woman. It was the last thing I ever expected of him. Ashenden's eyes travelled to the bowl of beautiful roses that stood on the table, but he said nothing. R, who missed little, saw the glance, and his look suddenly darkened. Ashenden knew that he felt like asking him what the devil he was staring at. At that moment, R had no friendly feelings towards his subordinate, but he made no remark. He went back to the subject in hand. Anyhow, that's neither here nor there. Chandra has fallen madly in love with a woman called Giulia Lazzari. He's crazy about her. Do you know how he picked her up? Of course I do. She's a dancer, and she does Spanish dances, but she happens to be an Italian. For stage purposes, she calls herself La Malagueña. You know the kind of thing? Popular Spanish music and a mantilla, a fan and a high comb. She's been dancing all over Europe for the last 10 years. Is she any good? No, rotten. She's been in the provinces in England, and she's had a few engagements in London. She never got more than £10 a week. Chandra met her in Berlin, in a tingle-tangle. You know what that is, a cheap sort of music hall. I take it that on the continent she looked upon her dancing chiefly as a means to enhance her value as a prostitute. How did she get to Berlin during the war? She's been married to a Spaniard at one time. I think she still is, though they don't live together, and she travelled on a Spanish passport. It appears Chandra made a dead set for her. R took up the Indian's photograph again and looked at it thoughtfully. You wouldn't have thought there was anything very attractive in that greasy little man. God, how they run to fat. The fact remains that she fell very nearly as much in love with him as he did with her. I've got her letters too, only copies, of course. He's got the originals, and I dare say he keeps them tied up in pink ribbon. She's mad about him. I'm not a literary man, but I think I know when a thing rings true. Anyhow, you'll be reading them, and you can tell me what you think. And then people say there's no such thing as love at first sight. R smiled with faint irony. He was certainly in a good humour this morning. But how did you get hold of all these letters? How did I get hold of them? How do you imagine? Owing to her Italian nationality, Giulia Lazzari was eventually expelled from Germany. She was put over the Dutch frontier. Having an engagement to dance in England, she was granted a visa, and looked up a date among the papers, and on the 24th of October last sailed from Rotterdam to Harwich. Since then, she has danced in London, Birmingham, Portsmouth, and other places. She was arrested a fortnight ago at Hull. What for? Espionage. She was transferred to London, and I went to see her myself at Holloway. Ashenden and R looked at one another for a moment without speaking, and it may be that each was trying his hardest to read the other's thoughts. Ashenden was wondering where the truth in all this lay, and R wondered how much of it he could advantageously tell him. How did you get on to her? I thought it odd that the Germans should allow her to dance quite quietly in Berlin for weeks, and then for no particular reason decide to put her out of the country. It would be a good introduction for espionage, and a dancer who was not too careful of her virtue might make opportunities of learning things that it would be worth somebody's while in Berlin to pay a good price for. I thought it might be as well to let her come to England and see what she was up to. I kept track of her. I discovered that she was sending letters to an address in Holland 2 or 3 times a week, and 2 or 3 times a week was receiving answers from Holland. Hers were written in a queer mixture of French, German, and English. She speaks English a little and French quite well, but the answers were written entirely in English. It was good English, but not an Englishman's English, flowery and rather grandiloquent. I wondered who was writing them. They seemed to be just ordinary love letters, but they were by way of being rather hot stuff. It was plain enough that they were coming from Germany, and the writer was neither English, French, nor German. Why did he write in English? The only foreigners who know English better than any continental language are Orientals, and not Turks or Egyptians either. They know French. A Jap would write English, and so would an Indian. I came to the conclusion that Giulia's lover was one of that gang of Indians that were making trouble for us in Berlin. I had no idea it was Chandra Lal till I found the photograph. How did you get that? She carried it about with her. It was a pretty good bit of work, that. She kept it locked up in her trunk with a lot of theatrical photographs of comic singers and clowns and acrobats. It might easily have passed for the picture of some music hall artiste in his stage dress. In fact, later, when she was arrested and asked who the photograph represented, she said she didn't know. It was an Indian conjurer who had given it her, and she had no idea what his name was. Anyhow, I put a very smart lad on the job, and he thought it queer that it should be the only photograph in the lot that came from Calcutta. He noticed that there was a number on the back, and he took it. The number, I mean. Of course, the photograph was replaced in the box. By the way, just as a matter of interest, how did your very smart lad get at the photograph at all? R's eyes twinkled. That's none of your business, but I don't mind telling you that he was a good-looking boy. Anyhow, it's of no consequence. When we got the number of the photograph, we cabled to Calcutta, and in a little while I received the grateful news that the object of Giulia's affections was no less a person than the incorruptible Chandra Lal. Then I thought it my duty to have Giulia watched a little more carefully. She seemed to have a sneaking fondness for naval officers. I couldn't exactly blame her for that. They are attractive, but it is unwise for ladies of easy virtue and doubtful nationality to cultivate their society in wartime. Presently, I got a very pretty little body of evidence against her. How is she getting her stuff through? She wasn't getting it through. She wasn't trying to. The Germans had turned her out quite genuinely. She wasn't working for them. She was working for Chandra. After her engagement was through in England, she was planning to go to Holland again and meet him. She wasn't very clever at the work. She was nervous, but it looked easy. No one seemed to bother about her. It grew rather exciting. She was getting all sorts of interesting information without any risk. In one of her letters she said, "I have so much to tell you, mon petit chou darling, and what you will be extrêmement intéressé to know." And she underlined the French words. R paused and rubbed his hands together. His tired face bore a look of devilish enjoyment of his own cunning. It was espionage made easy. Of course, I didn't care a damn about her. It was him I was after. Well, as soon as I'd got the goods on her, I arrested her. I had enough evidence to convict a regiment of spies. R put his hands in his pockets and his pale lips twisted to a smile that was almost a grimace. Holloway's not a very cheerful place, you know. "I imagine no prison is," remarked Ashenden. "I left her to stew in her own juice for a week before I went to see her. She was in a very pretty state of nerves by then. The wardress told me she'd been in violent hysterics most of the time. I must say she looked like the devil." "Is she handsome?" "You'll see for yourself. She's not my type. I dare say she's better when she's made up, and that kind of thing. I talked to her like a Dutch uncle. I put the fear of God into her. I told her she'd get 10 years. I think I scared her. I know I tried to. Of course she denied everything, but the proofs were there. I assured her she hadn't got a chance. I spent 3 hours with her. She went all to pieces, and at last she confessed everything. Then I told her that I'd let her go scot-free if she'd get Chandra to come to France. She absolutely refused. She said she'd rather die. She was very hysterical and tiresome, but I let her rave. I told her to think it over and said I'd see her in a day or two, and we'd have another talk about it. In point of fact, I left her for a week. She'd evidently had time to reflect, because when I came again, she asked me quite calmly what it was exactly that I proposed. She'd been in a jail a fortnight then, and I expect she'd had about enough of it. I put it to her as plainly as I could, and she accepted. "I don't think I quite understand," said Ashenden. "Don't you? I should have thought it was clear to the meanest intelligence. If she can get Chandra to cross the Swiss frontier and come into France, she's to go free either to Spain or to South America, with her passage paid. And how the devil is she to get Chandra to do that? He's madly in love with her. He's longing to see her. His letters are almost crazy. And she's written to him to say that she can't get a visa to Holland. I told you she was to join him there when her tour was over. But she can get one for Switzerland. That's a neutral country, and he's safe there. He jumped at the chance. They've arranged to meet at Lausanne." "Yes." "When he reaches Lausanne, he'll get a letter from her to say that the French authorities won't let her cross the frontier and that she's going to Thonon, which is just on the other side of the lake from Lausanne in France, and she's going to ask him to come there." "What makes you think he will?" R paused for an instant. He looked at Ashenden with a pleasant expression. "She must make him if she doesn't want to go to penal servitude for 10 years. "I see. She's arriving from England this evening in custody, and I should like you to take her down to Thonon by the night train." "Me?" said Ashenden. "Yes, I thought it the sort of job you could manage very well. Presumably you know more about human nature than most people. It'll be a pleasant change for you to spend a week or two at Thonon. I believe it's a pretty little place, fashionable too, in peacetime. You might take the baths there." "And what do you expect me to do when I get the lady down to Thonon?" "I leave you a free hand. I've made a few notes that may be useful to you. I'll read them to you, shall I?" Ashenden listened attentively. R's plan was simple and explicit. Ashenden could not but feel unwilling admiration for the brain that had so neatly devised it. Presently R suggested that they should have luncheon, and he asked Ashenden to take him to some place where they could see smart people. It amused Ashenden to see R, so sharp, sure of himself, and alert in his office, seized as he walked into the restaurant with shyness. He talked a little too loud in order to show that he was at his ease, and made himself somewhat unnecessarily at home. You saw in his manner the shabby and commonplace life he had led, till the hazards of war raised him to a position of consequence. He was glad to be in that fashionable restaurant cheek by jowl with the persons who bore great or distinguished names, but he felt like a schoolboy in his first top hat, and he quailed before the steely eye of the maître d'hôtel. His quick glance darted here and there, and his sallow face beamed with a self-satisfaction of which he was slightly ashamed. Ashenden drew his attention to an ugly woman in black with a lovely figure, wearing a long row of pearls. "That is Madame de Brides. She is the mistress of the Grand Duke Theodore. She's probably one of the most influential women in Europe. She's certainly one of the cleverest." R's clever eyes rested on her, and he flushed a little. "By George, this is life," he said. Ashenden watched him curiously. Luxury is dangerous to people who have never known it, and to whom its temptations are held out too suddenly. R, that shrewd, cynical man, was captivated by the vulgar glamour and the shoddy brilliance of the scene before him. Just as the advantage of culture is that it enables you to talk nonsense with distinction, so the habit of luxury allows you to regard its frills and furbelows with a proper contumely. But when they had eaten their luncheon and were drinking their coffee, Ashenden, seeing that R was mellowed by the good meal and his surroundings, went back to the subject that was in his thoughts. "That Indian fellow must be a rather remarkable chap," he said. "He's got brains, of course." One can't help being impressed by a man who had the courage to take on almost single-handed the whole British power in India. "I wouldn't get sentimental about him if I were you. He's nothing but a dangerous criminal. I don't suppose he'd use bombs if he could command a few batteries and half a dozen battalions. He uses what weapons he can. You can hardly blame him for that. After all, he's aiming at nothing for himself, is he? He's aiming at freedom for his country. On the face of it, it looks as though he were justified in his actions." But R had no notion of what Ashenden was talking. "That's very far-fetched and morbid," he said. "We can't go into all that. Our job is to get him, and when we've got him, to shoot him. Of course, he's declared war, and he must take his chance. I shall carry out your instructions. That's what I'm here for. But I see no harm in realizing that there's something to be admired and respected in him." R was once more the cool and astute judge of his fellows. "I've not yet made up my mind whether the best men for this kind of job are those who do it with passion or those who keep their heads. Some of them are filled with hatred for the people we're up against, and when we down them, it gives them a sort of satisfaction, like satisfying a personal grudge. Of course, they're very keen on their work. You're different, aren't you? You look at it like a game of chess, and you don't seem to have any feeling one way or the other. I can't quite make it out. Of course, for some sort of jobs, it's just what one wants." Ashenden did not answer. He called for the bill and walked back with R to the hotel. One of them worked with Ashenden on the French side of the Lake Geneva, and as Ashenden came up, he nodded to him. "Nan, I've asked the lady if she will dine in the restaurant car, but she prefers to have dinner in the carriage, so I've ordered a basket. Is that quite correct?" "Quite," said Ashenden. "My companion and I will go into the diner in turn, so that she will not remain alone." "That is very considerate of you. I will come along when we've started and have a chat with her." "She's not disposed to be very talkative," said the detective. "One could hardly expect it," replied Ashenden. He walked on to get his ticket for the second service and then returned to his own carriage. Giulia Lazzari was just finishing her meal when he went back to her. From a glance at the basket, he judged that she had not eaten with too poor an appetite. The detective who was guarding her opened the door when Ashenden appeared and, at Ashenden's suggestion, left them alone. Giulia Lazzari gave him a sullen look. "I hope you've had what you wanted for dinner," he said, as he sat down in front of her. She bowed slightly, but did not speak. He took out his case. "Will you have a cigarette?" She gave him a glance, seemed to hesitate, and then, still without a word, took one. He struck a match and, lighting it, looked at her. He was surprised. For some reason, he had expected her to be fair, perhaps from some notion that an Oriental would be more likely to fall for a blonde. But she was almost swarthy. Her hair was hidden by a close-fitting hat, but her eyes were coal-black. She was far from young. She might have been 35, and her skin was lined and sallow. She had at the moment no makeup on, and she looked haggard. There was nothing beautiful about her but her magnificent eyes. She was big, and Ashenden thought she must be too big to dance gracefully. It might be that in Spanish costume she was a bold and flaunting figure, but there in the train, shabbily dressed, there was nothing to explain the Indian's infatuation. She gave Ashenden a long, appraising stare. She wondered evidently what sort of man he was. She blew a cloud of smoke through her nostrils and gave it a glance, then looked back at Ashenden. He could see that her sullenness was only a mask. She was nervous and frightened. She spoke in French with an Italian accent. "Who are you?" "My name would mean nothing to you, madame. I am going to Thonon. I have taken a room for you at the Hotel de la Place. It is the only one open now. I think you will find it quite comfortable." "Ah, it is you the colonel spoke to me of. You are my jailer." "Only as a matter of form. I shall not intrude upon you. All the same, you are my jailer." "I hope not for very long. I have in my pocket your passport, with all the formalities completed, to permit you to go to Spain." She threw herself back into the corner of the carriage, white with those great black eyes. In the poor light, her face was suddenly a mask of despair. "It's infamous. Oh, I think I could die happy if I could only kill that old colonel. He has no heart. I'm so unhappy." "I'm afraid you have got yourself into a very unfortunate situation. Did you not know that espionage was a dangerous game?" "I never sold any of the secrets. I did no harm." "Surely only because you had no opportunity. I understand that you signed a full confession." Ashenden spoke to her as amiably as he could, a little as though he were talking to a sick person, and there was no harshness in his voice. "Oh, yes, I made a fool of myself. I wrote the letter the colonel said I was to write. Why isn't that enough? What is to happen to me if he does not answer? I cannot force him to come if he does not want to." "He has answered," said Ashenden. "I have the answer with me." She gave a gasp, and her voice broke. "Oh, show it to me. I beseech you to let me see it." "I have no objection to doing that, but you must return it to me." He took Chandra's letter from his pocket and gave it to her. She snatched it from his hand. She devoured it with her eyes. There were 8 pages of it, and as she read, the tears streamed down her cheeks. Between her sobs she gave little exclamations of love, calling the writer by pet names French and Italian. This was the letter that Chandra had written in reply to hers, telling him on R's instructions that she would meet him in Switzerland. He was mad with joy at the prospect. He told her in passionate phrases how long the time had seemed to him since they were parted, and how he had yearned for her. And now that he was to see her again so soon, he did not know how he was going to bear his impatience. She finished it and let it drop to the floor. "You can see he loves me, can't you? There's no doubt about that. I know something about it. Believe me. Do you really love him? Asked Ashenden. He's the only man who's ever been kind to me. It's not very gay, the life one leads in these music halls, all over Europe, never resting, and men, they are not much, the men who haunt those places. At first I thought he was just like the rest of them. Ashenden picked up the letter and replaced it in his pocketbook. A telegram was sent in your name to the address in Holland to say that you would be at the Hotel Gibbons at Lausanne on the 14th. That is tomorrow. Yes. She threw up her head and her eyes flashed. Oh, it is an infamous thing that you are forcing me to do. It is shameful. You are not obliged to do it, said Ashenden. And if I don't, I'm afraid you must take the consequences. I can't go to prison, she cried out suddenly. I can't. I have such a short time before me. He said 10 years. Is it possible I could be sentenced to 10 years? If the colonel told you so, it is very possible. Oh, I know him. That cruel face. He would have no mercy. And what should I be in 10 years? Oh, no, no. At that moment, the train stopped at a station, and the detective, waiting in the corridor, tapped on the window. Ashenden opened the door, and the man gave him a picture postcard. It was a dull little view of Pontarlier, the frontier station between France and Switzerland, and showed a dusty place with a statue in the middle and a few plane trees. Ashenden handed her a pencil. Will you write this postcard to your lover? It will be posted at Pontarlier. Address it to the hotel at Lausanne. She gave him a glance, but without answering took it and wrote as he directed. Now on the other side write, delayed at frontier, but everything all right. Wait at Lausanne. Then add whatever you like, 10 dresses, if you lie. He took the postcard from her, read it, to see that she had done as he directed, and then reached for his hat. Well, I shall leave you now. I hope you will have a sleep. I will fetch you in the morning when we arrive at Thonon. The second detective had now returned from his dinner, and as Ashenden came out of the carriage, the two men went in. Giulia Lazzari huddled back into her corner. Ashenden gave the postcard to an agent who was waiting to take it to Pontarlier and then made his way along the crowded train to his sleeping car. It was bright and sunny, though cold next morning when they reached their destination. Ashenden, having given his bags to a porter, walked along the platform to where Giulia Lazzari and the two detectives were standing. Ashenden nodded to them. Well, good morning. You need not trouble to wait. They touched their hats, gave a word of farewell to the woman, and walked away. Where are they going? She asked. Off. You will not be bothered with them any more. Am I in your custody, then? You're in nobody's custody. I'm going to permit myself to take you to your hotel, and then I shall leave you. You must try to get a good rest. Ashenden's porter took her hand luggage, and she gave him the ticket for her trunk. They walked out of the station. A cab was waiting for them, and Ashenden begged her to get in. It was a longish drive to the hotel, and now and then Ashenden felt that she gave him a sidelong glance. She was perplexed. He sat without a word. When they reached the hotel, the proprietor, it was a small hotel, prettily situated at the corner of a little promenade, and it had a charming view, showed them the room that had been prepared for Madame Lazzari. Ashenden turned to him. That'll do very nicely, I think. I shall come down in a minute. The proprietor bowed and withdrew. I shall do my best to see that you are comfortable, madam, said Ashenden. You are here absolutely your own mistress, and you may order pretty well anything you like. To the proprietor, you are just a guest of the hotel like any other. You are absolutely free. Free to go out? She asked quickly. Of course. With a policeman on either side of me, I suppose. Not at all. You are as free in the hotel as though you were in your own house, and you are free to go out and come in when you choose. I should like an assurance from you that you will not write letters without my knowledge or attempt to leave Thonon without my permission. She gave Ashenden a long stare. She could not make it out at all. She looked as though she thought it a dream. I am in a position that forces me to give you any assurance you ask. I give you my word of honor that I will not write a letter without showing it to you or attempt to leave this place. Thank you. Now, I will leave you. I will do myself the pleasure of coming to see you tomorrow morning. Ashenden nodded and went out. He stopped for 5 minutes at the police station to see that everything was in order and then took the cab up the hill to a little secluded house on the outskirts of the town at which on his periodical visits to this place he stayed. It was pleasant to have a bath and a shave and get into slippers. He felt lazy and spent the rest of the morning reading a novel. Soon after dark, for even at Thonon, though it was in France, it was thought desirable to attract attention to Ashenden as little as possible, an agent from the police station came to see him. His name was Felix. He was a little dark Frenchman with sharp eyes and an unshaven chin, dressed in a shabby grey suit and rather down at heel, so that he looked like a lawyer's clerk out of work. Ashenden offered him a glass of wine, and they sat down by the fire. "Well, your lady lost no time," he said. Within a quarter of an hour of her arrival, she was out of the hotel with a bundle of clothes and trinkets that she sold in a shop near the market. When the afternoon boat came in, she went down to the quay and bought a ticket to Evian. Evian, it should be explained, was the next place along the lake in France, and from there, crossing over, the boat went to Switzerland. Of course she hadn't a passport, so permission to embark was denied her. How did she explain that she had no passport? She said she'd forgotten it. She said she had an appointment to see friends in Evian, and tried to persuade the official in charge to let her go. She attempted to slip 100 francs into his hand. "She must be a stupider woman than I thought," said Ashenden. But when next day he went about 11 in the morning to see her, he made no reference to her attempt to escape. She had had time to arrange herself, and now, her hair elaborately done, her lips and cheeks painted, she looked less haggard than when he had first seen her. "I've brought you some books," said Ashenden. "I'm afraid the time hangs heavy on your hands." "What does that matter to you?" "I have no wish that you should suffer anything that can be avoided. Anyhow, I will leave them, and you can read them, or not as you choose." "If you only knew how I hated you, it would doubtless make me very uncomfortable. But I really don't know why you should. I am only doing what I have been ordered to do." "What do you want of me now? I do not suppose you have come only to ask after my health." Ashenden smiled. "I want you to write a letter to your lover, telling him that owing to some irregularity in your passport, the Swiss authorities would not let you cross the frontier. So you have. Come here, where it is very nice and quiet, so quiet that one can hardly realize there is a war, and you propose that Chandra should join you. Do you think he is a fool? He will refuse. Then you must do your best to persuade him." She looked at Ashenden a long time before she answered. He suspected that she was debating within herself whether by writing the letter, and so seeming docile, she could not gain time. "Well, dictate, and I will write what you say. I should prefer you to put it in your own words. Give me half an hour, and the letter shall be ready." "I will wait here," said Ashenden. "Why?" "Because I prefer to." Her eyes flashed angrily, but controlling herself, she said nothing. On the chest of drawers were writing materials. She sat down at the dressing table and began to write. When she handed Ashenden the letter, he saw that even through her rouge she was very pale. It was the letter of a person not much used to expressing herself by means of pen and ink, but it was well enough, and when towards the end, starting to say how much she loved the man, she had been carried away and wrote with all her heart. It had really a certain passion. "Now add The man who is bringing this is Swiss. You can trust him absolutely. I didn't want the censor to see it." She hesitated an instant, but then wrote as he directed. "How do you spell absolutely?" "As you like. Now address an envelope, and I will relieve you of my unwelcome presence." He gave the letter to the agent, who was waiting to take it across the lake. Ashenden brought her the reply the same evening. She snatched it from his hands and for a moment pressed it to her heart. When she read it, she uttered a little cry of relief. "He won't come." The letter, in the Indian's flowery, stilted English, expressed his bitter disappointment. He told her how intensely he had looked forward to seeing her and implored her to do everything in the world to smooth the difficulties that prevented her from crossing the frontier. He said that it was impossible for him to come. Impossible. There was a price on his head, and it would be madness for him to think of risking it. He attempted to be jocular. She did not want her little fat lover to be shot, did she? "He won't come," she repeated. "He won't come." "You must write and tell him that there is no risk. You must say that if there were, you would not dream of asking him. You must say that if he loves you, he will not hesitate." "I won't. I won't." "Don't be a fool. You can't help yourself." She burst into a sudden flood of tears. She flung herself on the floor and, seizing Ashenden's knees, implored him to have mercy on her. "I will do anything in the world for you if you will let me go." "Don't be absurd," said Ashenden. "Do you think I want to become your lover? Come, come, you must be serious. You know the alternative." She raised herself to her feet and, changing on a sudden to fury, flung at Ashenden one foul name after another. "I like you much better like that," he said. "Now will you write, or shall I send for the police?" "He will not come. It is useless. It is very much to your interest to make him come." "What do you mean by that?" "Do you mean that if I do everything in my power and fail, that—" She looked at Ashenden with wild eyes. "Yes, it means either you or him." She staggered. She put her hand to her heart. Then, without a word, she reached for pen and paper. But the letter was not to Ashenden's liking, and he made her write it again. When she had finished, she flung herself on the bed and burst once more into passionate weeping. Her grief was real, but there was something theatrical in the expression of it that prevented it from being peculiarly moving to Ashenden. He felt his relation to her as impersonal as a doctor's in the presence of a pain that he cannot alleviate. He saw now why R had given him this peculiar task. It needed a cool head and an emotion well under control. He did not see her next day. The answer to the letter was not delivered to him till after dinner, when it was brought to Ashenden's little house by Felix. "Well, what news have you?" "Our friend is getting desperate," smiled the Frenchman. "This afternoon she walked up to the station just as a train was about to start for Lyons. She was looking up and down uncertainly, so I went to her and asked if there was anything I could do. I introduced myself as an agent of the Sûreté. If looks could kill, I should not be standing here now." "Sit down, mon ami," said Ashenden. "Merci." She walked away. She evidently thought it was no use to try to get on the train. "But I have something more interesting to tell you. She has offered a boatman on the lake 1,000 francs to take her across to Lausanne." "What did he say to her?" "He said he couldn't risk it." "Yes?" The little agent gave his shoulders a slight shrug and smiled. "She's asked him to meet her on the road that leads to Evian at 10 o'clock tonight, so that they can talk of it again, and she's given him to understand that she will not repulse too fiercely the advances of a lover. I have told him to do what he likes so long as he comes and tells me everything that is of importance." "Are you sure you can trust him?" asked Ashenden. "Oh, quite. He knows nothing, of course, but that she is under surveillance. You need have no fear about him. He is a good boy. I have known him all his life." Ashenden read Chandra's letter. It was eager and passionate. It throbbed strangely with the painful yearning of his heart. Love. Yes, if Ashenden knew anything of it, there was the real thing. He told her how he spent the long hours walking by the lakeside and looking towards the coast of France, how near they were, and yet so desperately parted. He repeated again and again that he couldn't come, and begged her not to ask him. He would do everything in the world for her, but that he dared not do, and yet if she insisted, how could he resist her? He besought her to have mercy on him. And then he broke into a long wail at the thought that he must go away without seeing her. He asked her if there were not some means by which she could slip over. He swore that if he could ever hold her in his arms again, he would never let her go. Even the forced and elaborate language in which it was written could not dim the hot fire that burned the pages. It was the letter of a madman. "When will you hear the result of her interview with the boatman?" asked Ashenden. "I have arranged to meet him at the landing stage between 11 and 12. Ashenden looked at his watch. "I will come with you." They walked down the hill, and reaching the quay for shelter from the cold wind, stood in the lee of the custom-house. At last they saw a man approaching, and Felix stepped out of the shadow that hid them. "Antoine." "Monsieur Felix, I have a letter for you. I promise to take it to Lausanne by the first boat tomorrow." Ashenden gave the man a brief glance, but did not ask what had passed between him and Giulia Lazzari. He took the letter, and by the light of Felix's electric torch read it. It was in faulty German. "On no account come. Pay no attention to my letters. Danger. I love you, sweetheart. Don't come." "Da." He put it in his pocket, gave the boatman 50 francs, and went home to bed. But the next day, when he went to see Giulia Lazzari, he found her door locked. He knocked for some time. There was no answer. He called her. "Madame Lazzari, you must open the door. I want to speak to you. I am in bed. I am ill, and can see no one. I am sorry, but you must open the door. If you are ill, I will send for a doctor." "No, go away. I will see no one." "If you do not open the door, I shall send for a locksmith and have it broken open." There was a silence, and then he heard the key turned in the lock. He went in. She was in a dressing gown, and her hair was disheveled. She had evidently just got out of bed. "I am at the end of my strength. I can do nothing more. You have only to look at me to see that I am ill. I have been sick all night. I shall not keep you long. Would you like to see a doctor?" "What good can a doctor do me?" "No." He took out of his pocket the letter she had given the boatman and handed it to her. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked. She gave a gasp at the sight of it, and her sallow face went green. "You gave me your word that you would neither attempt to escape nor write a letter without my knowledge." "Did you think I would keep my word?" she cried, her voice ringing with scorn. "No. To tell you the truth, it was not entirely for your convenience that you were placed in a comfortable hotel rather than in the local jail. But I think I should tell you that though you have your freedom to go in and out as you like, you have no more chance of getting away from Thonon than if you were chained by the leg in a prison cell. It is silly to waste your time writing letters that will never be delivered. Cochon." She flung the opprobrious word at him with all the violence that was in her. "But you must sit down and write a letter that will be delivered." "Never. I will do nothing more. I will not write another word. You came here on the understanding that you would do certain things. I will not do them. It is finished. You had better reflect a little." "Reflect? I have reflected. You can do what you like. I don't care." "Very well. I will give you 5 minutes to change your mind." Ashenden took out his watch and looked at it. He sat down on the edge of the unmade bed. "Oh, it has got on my nerves, this hotel. Why did you not put me in the prison? Why? Everywhere I went, I felt that spies were on my heels. It is infamous what you're making me do. Infamous. What is my crime? I ask you, what have I done? Am I not a woman? It is infamous what you are asking me to do. Infamous. She spoke in a high, shrill voice. She went on and on. At last, the 5 minutes were up. Ashenden had not said a word. He rose. "Yes, go, go," she shrieked at him. She flung foul names at him. "I shall come back," said Ashenden. He took the key out of the door as he went out of the room and locked it behind him. Going downstairs, he hurriedly scribbled a note, called the Boots, and dispatched him with it to the police station. Then he went up again. Giulia Lazzari had thrown herself on her bed and turned her face to the wall. Her body was shaken with hysterical sobs. She gave no sign that she heard him come in. Ashenden sat down on the chair in front of the dressing-table and looked idly at the odds and ends that littered it. The toilet things were cheap and tawdry, and none too clean. There were little shabby pots of rouge and cold cream and little bottles of black for the eyebrows and eyelashes. The hairpins were horrid and greasy. The room was untidy, and the air was heavy with the smell of cheap scent. Ashenden thought of the hundreds of rooms she must have occupied in third-rate hotels in the course of her wandering life from provincial town to provincial town in one country after another. He wondered what had been her origins. She was a coarse and vulgar woman, but what had she been when young? She was not the type he would have expected to adopt that career, for she seemed to have no advantages that could help her, and he asked himself whether she came of a family of entertainers. There are all over the world families in which for generations the members have become dancers or acrobats or comic singers, or whether she had fallen into the life accidentally through some lover in the business who had for a time made her his partner. And what men must she have known in all these years, the comrades of the shows she was in, the agents and managers who looked upon it as a perquisite of their position that they should enjoy her favours, the merchants or well-to-do tradesmen, the young sparks of the various towns she played in, who were attracted for the moment by the glamour of the dancer or the blatant sensuality of the woman. To her they were the paying customers, and she accepted them indifferently as the recognized and admitted supplement to her miserable salary. But to them, perhaps, she was romance. In her bought arms they caught sight for a moment of the brilliant world of the capitals, and ever so distantly and however shoddily of the adventure and the glamour of a more spacious life. There was a sudden knock at the door, and Ashenden immediately cried out, "Entree!" Giulia Lazzari sprang up in bed to a sitting posture. "Who is it?" she called. She gave a gasp as she saw the two detectives who had brought her from Boulogne and handed her over to Ashenden at Thonon. "You! What do you want?" she shrieked. "Allons, levez-vous," said one of them, and his voice had a sharp abruptness that suggested that he would put up with no nonsense. "I'm afraid you must get up, Madame Lazzari," said Ashenden. "I am delivering you once more to the care of these gentlemen." "How can I get up? I'm ill, I tell you. I cannot stand. Do you want to kill me?" "If you won't dress yourself, we shall have to dress you, and I'm afraid we shouldn't do it very cleverly. Come, come, it's no good making a scene." "Where are you going to take me?" "They're going to take you back to England." One of the detectives took hold of her arm. "Don't touch me, don't come near me," she screamed furiously. "Let her be," said Ashenden. "I'm sure she'll see the necessity of making as little trouble as possible." "I'll dress myself." Ashenden watched her as she took off her dressing-gown and slipped a dress over her head. She forced her feet into shoes obviously too small for her. She arranged her hair. Every now and then she gave the detectives a hurried, sullen glance. Ashenden wondered if she would have the nerve to go through with it. R would call him a damned fool, but he almost wished she would. She went up to the dressing-table, and Ashenden stood up in order to let her sit down. She greased her face quickly and then rubbed off the grease with a dirty towel. She powdered herself and made up her eyes. But her hand shook. The three men watched her in silence. She rubbed the rouge on her cheeks and painted her mouth. Then she crammed a hat down on her head. Ashenden made a gesture to the first detective, and he took a pair of handcuffs out of his pocket and advanced towards her. At the sight of them, she started back violently and flung her arms wide. "Non, non, non, je ne veux pas. No, not them. No, no." "Come, ma fille, don't be silly," said the detective roughly. As though for protection, very much to his surprise, she flung her arms round Ashenden. "Don't let them take me. Have mercy on me. I can't. Ashenden extricated himself as best he could. "I can do nothing more for you." The detective seized her wrists and was about to affix the handcuffs when, with a great cry, she threw herself down on the floor. "I will do what you wish. I will do everything." On a sign from Ashenden, the detectives left the room. He waited for a little till she had regained a certain calm. She was lying on the floor, sobbing passionately. He raised her to her feet and made her sit down. "What do you want me to do?" she gasped. "I want you to write another letter to Chandra. My head is in a whirl. I could not put two phrases together. You must give me time." But Ashenden felt that it was better to get her to write a letter while she was under the effect of her terror. He did not want to give her time to collect herself. "I will dictate the letter to you. All you have to do is to write exactly what I tell you." She gave a deep sigh, but took the pen and the paper and sat down before them at the dressing table. "If I do this and you succeed, how do I know that I shall be allowed to go free? The colonel promised that you should. You must take my word for it that I shall carry out his instructions. I should look a fool if I betrayed my friend and then went to prison for 10 years. I'll tell you your best guarantee of our good faith. Except by reason of Chandra, you are not of the smallest importance to us. Why should we put ourselves to the bother and expense of keeping you in prison when you can do us no harm?" She reflected for an instant. She was composed now. It was as though, having exhausted her emotion, she had become, on a sudden, a sensible and practical woman. "Tell me what you want me to write." Ashenden hesitated. He thought he could put the letter more or less in the way she would naturally have put it, but he had to give it consideration. It must be neither fluent nor literary. He knew that in moments of emotion, people are inclined to be melodramatic and stilted. In a book or on the stage, this always rings false, and the author has to make his people speak more simply and with less emphasis than in fact they do. It was a serious moment, but Ashenden felt that there were in it elements of the comic. "I didn't know I loved a coward," he started. "If you loved me, you couldn't hesitate when I asked you to come." Underline couldn't twice. He went on. "When I promise you there is no danger. If you don't love me, you are right not to come. Don't come. Go back to Berlin where you are in safety. I am sick of it. I am alone here. I have made myself ill by waiting for you, and every day I have said he is coming. If you loved me, you would not hesitate so much. It is quite clear to me that you do not love me. I am sick and tired of you. I have no money. This hotel is impossible. There is nothing for me to stay for. I can get an engagement in Paris. I have a friend there who has made me serious propositions. I have wasted long enough over you, and look what I have got from it. It is finished. Goodbye. You will never find a woman who will love you as I have loved you. I cannot afford to refuse the proposition of my friend, so I have telegraphed to him, and as soon as I shall receive his answer, I go to Paris. I do not blame you because you do not love me. That is not your fault. But you must see that I should be a stupid to go on wasting my life. One is not young forever. Goodbye. Giulia. When Ashenden read over the letter, he was not altogether satisfied. but it was the best he could do. It had an air of verisimilitude which the words lacked because, knowing little English, she had written phonetically. The spelling was atrocious, and the handwriting like a child's. She had crossed out words and written them over again. Some of the phrases he had put in French. Once or twice tears had fallen on the pages and blurred the ink. "I leave you now," said Ashenden. "It may be that when next you see me, I shall be able to tell you that you are free to go where you choose. Where do you want to go?" "Spain." "Very well, I will have everything prepared." She shrugged her shoulders. He left her. There was nothing now for Ashenden to do but wait. He sent a messenger to Lausanne in the afternoon, and next morning went down to the quay to meet the boat. There was a waiting room next to the ticket office, and here he told the detectives to hold themselves in readiness. When a boat arrived, the passengers advanced along the pier in line, and their passports were examined before they were allowed to go ashore. If Chandra came and showed his passport, and it was very likely that he was travelling with a false one, issued probably by a neutral nation, he was to be asked to wait, and Ashenden was to identify him. Then he would be arrested. It was with some excitement that Ashenden watched the boat come in, and the little group of people gathered at the gangway. He scanned them closely, but saw no one who looked in the least like an Indian. Chandra had not come. Ashenden did not know what to do. He had played his last card. There were not more than half a dozen passengers for Thonon, and when they had been examined and gone their way, he strolled along the pier. "Well, it's no go," he said to Felix, who had been examining the passports. "The gentleman I expected hasn't turned up. I have a letter for you." He handed Ashenden an envelope addressed to Madame Lazzari, on which he immediately recognized the spidery handwriting of Chandra Lal. At that moment, the steamer from Geneva, which was going to Lausanne, and the end of the lake hove in sight. It arrived at Thonon every morning 20 minutes after the steamer going in the opposite direction had left. Ashenden had an inspiration. "Where is the man who brought it?" "He's in the ticket office." "Give him the letter and tell him to return to the person who gave it to him. He is to say that he took it to the lady and she sent it back. If the person asks him to take another letter, he is to say that it is not much good, as she is packing her trunk and leaving Thonon." He saw the letter handed over and the instructions given, and then walked back to his little house in the country. The next boat on which Chandra could possibly come arrived about 5, and having at that hour an important engagement with an agent working in Germany, he warned Felix that he might be a few minutes late. But if Chandra came, he could easily be detained. There was no great hurry, since the train in which he was to be taken to Paris did not start till shortly after 8. When Ashenden had finished his business, he strolled leisurely down to the lake. It was light still, and from the top of the hill he saw the steamer pulling out. It was an anxious moment, and instinctively he quickened his steps. Suddenly he saw someone running towards him and recognized the man who had taken the letter. "Quick, quick!" he cried. "He's there!" Ashenden's heart gave a great thud against his chest. At last. He began to run too, and as they ran the man, panting, told him how he had taken back the unopened letter. When he put it in the Indian's hand, he turned frightfully pale. "I should never have thought an Indian could turn that color," he said, and turned it over and over in his hand as though he could not understand what his own letter was doing there. Tears sprang to his eyes and rolled down his cheeks. It was grotesque. "He's fat, you know." He said something in a language the man did not understand, and then in French asked him when the boat went to Thonon. When he got on board, he looked about, but did not see him. Then he caught sight of him, huddled up in an ulster, with his hat drawn down over his eyes, standing alone in the bows. During the crossing, he kept his eyes fixed on Thonon. "Where is he now?" asked Ashenden. "I got off first, and Monsieur Felix told me to come for you." "I suppose they're holding him in the waiting room." Ashenden was out of breath when they reached the pier. He burst into the waiting room. A group of men, talking at the top of their voices and gesticulating wildly, were clustered round a man lying on the ground. "What's happened?" he cried. "Look," said Monsieur Felix. Chandra Lal lay there, his eyes wide open and a thin line of foam on his lips, dead. His body was horribly contorted. "He's killed himself. We've sent for the doctor. He was too quick for us." A sudden thrill of horror passed through Ashenden. When the Indian landed, Felix recognized from the description that he was the man they wanted. There were only 4 passengers. He was the last. Felix took an exaggerated time to examine the passports of the first 3 and then took the Indians. It was a Spanish one, and it was all in order. Felix asked the regulation questions and noted them on the official sheet. Then he looked at him pleasantly and said, "Just come into the waiting room for a moment. There are 1 or 2 formalities to fulfill." "Is my passport not in order?" the Indian asked. "Perfectly." Chandra hesitated, but then followed the official to the door of the waiting room. Felix opened it and stood aside. "Entrez?" Chandra went in, and the 2 detectives stood up. He must have suspected at once that they were police officers and realized that he had fallen into a trap. "Sit down," said Felix. "I have 1 or 2 questions to put to you." "It is hot in here," he said, and in point of fact they had a little stove there that kept the place like an oven. "I will take off my coat if you permit." "Certainly," said Felix graciously. He took off his coat, apparently with some effort, and he turned to put it on a chair, and then, before they realized what had happened, they were startled to see him stagger and fall heavily to the ground. While taking off his coat, Chandra had managed to swallow the contents of a bottle that was still clasped in his hand. Ashenden put his nose to it. There was a very distinct odor of almonds. For a little while, they looked at the man who lay on the floor. Felix was apologetic. "Will they be very angry?" he asked nervously. "I don't see that it was your fault," said Ashenden. "Anyhow, he can do no more harm. For my part, I am just as glad he killed himself. The notion of his being executed did not make me very comfortable." In a few minutes the doctor arrived and pronounced life extinct. "Prussic acid," he said to Ashenden. Ashenden nodded. "I will go and see Madame Lazzari," he said. "If she wants to stay a day or 2 longer, I shall let her. But if she wants to go tonight, of course she can. Will you give the agents at the station instructions to let her pass?" "I shall be at the station myself," said Felix. Ashenden once more climbed the hill. It was night now, a cold, bright night with an unclouded sky, and the sight of the new moon, a white shining thread, made him turn 3 times the money in his pocket. When he entered the hotel, he was seized on a sudden with distaste for its cold banality. It smelt of cabbage and boiled mutton. On the walls of the hall were coloured posters of railway companies advertising Grenoble, Carcassonne, and the bathing places of Normandy. He went upstairs and, after a brief knock, opened the door of Giulia Lazzari's room. She was sitting in front of her dressing table, looking at herself in the glass, just idly, despairingly, apparently doing nothing, and it was in this that she saw Ashenden as he came in. Her face changed suddenly as she caught sight of his, and she sprang up so vehemently that the chair fell over. "What is it? Why are you so white?" she cried. She turned round and stared at him, and her features were gradually twisted to a look of horror. "Il est pris," she gasped. "Il est mort," said Ashenden. "Dead. He took the poison. He had the time for that. He's escaped you after all." "What do you mean? How did you know about the poison?" "He always carried it with him. He said that the English should never take him alive." Ashenden reflected for an instant. She had kept that secret well. He supposed the possibility of such a thing should have occurred to him. How was he to anticipate these melodramatic devices? "Well, now you are free. You can go wherever you like, and no obstacle shall be put in your way. Here are your ticket and your passport, and here is the money that was in your possession when you were arrested. Do you wish to see Chandra?" She started. "No, no." "There is no need. I thought you might care to." She did not weep. Ashenden supposed that she had exhausted all her emotion. She seemed apathetic. "A telegram will be sent tonight to the Spanish frontier to instruct the authorities to put no difficulties in your way. If you will take my advice, you will get out of France as soon as you can." She said nothing, and since Ashenden had no more to say, he made ready to go. "I am sorry that I have had to show myself so hard to you. I am glad to think that now the worst of your troubles are over, and I hope that time will assuage the grief that I know you must feel for the death of your friend." Ashenden gave her a little bow and turned to the door. But she stopped him. "One little moment," she said. "There is one thing I should like to ask. I think you have some heart. Whatever I can do for you, you may be sure I will. What are they going to do with his things?" "I don't know." "Why?" Then she said something that confounded Ashenden. It was the last thing he expected. "He had a wristwatch that I gave him last Christmas. It cost £12. Can I have it back?"